Okay, so now that we've talked about what behavior is and how it can serve different functions, we're going to focus on one really important skill that you should use constantly, and that is writing operational definitions of behavior. Think of this as a way to make sure everyone on your team is speaking the same language. So if we think of behavior as its own language, this is how we actually begin translating it for everyone else. Well, what do we mean by an operational definition? An operational definition is a clear, objective, and measurable description of behavior. Those three terms are very important here. And what do they really mean? It means that we are describing exactly what the behavior looks like in a way that anyone watching could also identify it. There is no guessing or interpreting, and we can actually see what happens and track how often it occurs. So, for example, instead of saying that student is being disruptive, which is vague and subjective, you could better define that behavior and say that student left their seat and walked around the classroom without permission during independent work time. That's still a little bit vague. We can definitely get a lot more in there as we'll see, but it's a much better description. That second version is much more specific and observable than just saying the student was being disruptive. In this example, in the second example there, we could count also how many times that behavior happens or how long it actually lasts. And that's the power of an operational definition. It helps us measure behavior so that we can support students more effectively and efficiently. Why would we need to write or use operational definitions in the first place? Well, usually because a behavior is happening often enough, intensely enough, or disruptively enough that it's getting in the way of learning. And maybe it's impacting that one student or other students, or it's not improving within your typical classroom strategies. Everything you're trying to do that have worked for so many other students or you think could work are not actually being effective. And when that happens, we need more than just a gut feeling or that vague sense of like something's off. We need to collect data so that we can understand the behavior and we can figure out how to support it. Before we start collecting data, we also need to be crystal clear on what we're collecting. And that's where the operational definition comes in. So we remember that in operational definitions, it is a clear, objective, and measurable description of a behavior. If we can't describe the behavior in a way that anyone else could recognize and measure, then any data we end up actually collecting is going to be messy and probably meaningless. And that's honestly just a giant waste of our time. And so the first big reason operational definitions matter is because they lead to consistent data collection. If you are collecting data on a behavior by yourself, having an operational definition helps ensure that you are collecting that specific data that you need. And your observations are trustworthy because you've clearly defined what you're tracking. However, when it comes to behavior tracking, it often is not actually a solo job. In many cases, more than one adult is involved. There are teachers and paras and aides and specialists, families, many different people can take part in this and track some data. But that also means we're relying on multiple people to observe and document behavior in the same way, which is difficult if you don't have a clearly defined behavior. And if your behavior is not clearly defined, you're going to end up with one person tracking their version of what off task is and someone else doing something completely different. That would make that data unreliable. And if your data is not reliable, we can't trust it to make our decisions or to help guide our decisions. Let's take a student example, Armando. And his teacher, Miss Belkis, notices that he's off task during independent work time. Now, if the teacher and the para observe the behavior together and define it very specifically as Armando is off task when he puts his head down or turns to talk to a peer for more than 5 seconds during independent work time, that's much more a clear operational definition. Both Ms. Belkis and this para can see that behavior happen. They can see every single time that Armando puts his head down or when he turns to talk to a peer for more than 5 seconds, specifically during independent work time. And if they can see that happening, they can both track the same thing. And that's how we get usable data. But if the teacher, let's say, if I just go to the para and I say, hey, can you track every time Armando's off task? And I don't really explain what this looks like. I assume for whatever reason that you know what I mean by off task. And now my para is doing their best job and tracking maybe every time Armando's looking around the room or fidgeting or he's not raising his hand and just talking. And that's not what the teacher specifically was trying to get at in that moment. I'm tracking something else and none of them actually had to do with what the pair is tracking. But all of a sudden we got data that says Armando's off task constantly, but we are not defining any of those correctly. And maybe some of those aren't actually off task behaviors. So using an operational definition to describe a behavior takes the guesswork out of what we're tracking. It also allows other people to see it and say, yep, I understand what it is you're tracking, and we can look at patterns and we can figure some stuff out from there. So whoever is collecting data with you, or if you're collecting data with someone, it is important to create these definitions so everyone knows exactly what to look for. Which kind of leads us to our second reason why operational definitions matter, is that they also help lead to more effective behavior supports. Again, if we don't clearly define the behavior, we can't intervene effectively. Saying he's being disruptive doesn't help us build an actual support plan, because what does that even mean? As we learn, disruptive can be many different things. And just saying disruptive is too vague to act on. But instead saying he gets up from his seat without permission and average of 3 times during independent work, now we have a clear target. We know exactly what we're trying to change or support. When we combine the clear definition of a behavior along with our understanding of the functions of that behavior, we are in a much stronger position to choose that right intervention. Think about it. If Armando is getting up to escape doing independent work versus getting up to get the attention of his crush across the class, those are 2 very different functions, and they call for very different strategies. If my student Armando is, having all of these off-task behaviors that we have then defined very clearly because he perceives that work to be too hard and he's not trying to really mess with it right now, we have to provide interventions that are going to help him actually get through the work and learn and move past those internal feelings of this work is too hard. However, if we got Armando who's really interested in his crush who's sitting across the class and they keep getting up because they want to go talk to them or see them or want to make sure that crush doesn't forget who they are, then we have to do something to hone in on Armando's need for attention there. And that's going to call for something completely different than us trying to incentivize them to do work. Either way, the work needs to be done, but we have to redirect the behavior according to what the student's trying to get out of their behavior. So we can only match the support to the function if we're clear on what the behavior actually looks like as well. The definition gives us the what, the function gives us the why, and together they help guide us on the how we're going to deal with this, fix it, support it. And the final reason why operational definitions matter is because they also lead to better communication across support team and team members. When we use these operational definitions, everyone who is involved, the teachers, the paras, the behavior specialists, the families, sometimes even the students, they know exactly what we're talking about. There's no confusion, there's no assumptions, and what is left is just a shared understanding that we are attacking this specific behavior right now. And that will make collaboration just a whole lot better if everyone is on that same page. So these are some actual vague terms I have either myself used and been guilty of, or have certainly heard from teachers, and they are to describe behavior. We use these words constantly: off task, aggressive, disruptive. So as an example, Madison was off task during math. Janice was being aggressive to others during recess. Tomas was disruptive during silent reading. Sure, those were all said. But what do they actually look like? So let's look at the off-task example. If we're saying Madison is off task, this could mean so many things. We need to be more specific, like in our previous examples there with Armando. Is Madison doodling on the paper? Is she talking? Is she zoning out and looking away from the paper for a specific amount of time? What's happening there that we are counting as off task? And instead of saying Janice was being aggressive to others during recess, we would be more specific in describing that behavior by saying Janice hit her peer with her right hand in a closed fist. That is exactly what happened in that behavior, and that is how we described aggressive. In our last example there, instead of saying Thomas was being disruptive during silent reading, we would be more specific and say Thomas made loud vocalizations such as humming and tapping his pencil and singing during silent reading time. All right. This next scenario here comes from a really great YouTube channel called the ABA Master, and it really drives home the importance of clear definitions when we're collecting behavior data. So by now we know that operational definitions are essential for accurate data collection. But when a definition is vague, people are left guessing, and they might interpret things differently, and suddenly we're not tracking the same thing at all. Let's look at this example for a student Justin, who has been observed to cry, tantrum, and flop as it's been defined. So crying in this instance has been defined as any case in which Justin begins to cry. And tantrum is any case in which Justin cries or screams. And then flopping is any instance in which Justin falls to the ground. At first glance, these definitions might seem fine, but they're actually a little too vague and in some cases overlapping. Because if tantrum also includes cry, then am I tracking crying or am I tracking tantrum? So it gets really interesting here, and we need to be far more specific than just these definitions here. Let's say in the scenario, three different people were observing the same incident, and one might say Justin's crying. The other one might say he's tantruming. The third person might be in there and be like, what are you talking about? I saw that he was flopping on the ground. Even though they're watching the exact same behavior, because of these definitions, they are tracking something different. And that's a problem because now we have data on behavior that is inconsistent. It just doesn't make sense. They're like at the exact same time, he was doing all three, which is not an impossible thing to do, but we need to be better defining of that. And we're not, what this ends up meaning, we're not getting a reliable picture of what's actually happening. So let's take a look at a much more precise definition of Justin's behavior. Here, crying or screaming is defined as any instance in which Justin engages in a vocalization louder than what is used for communication for longer than 3 seconds, during which time he may or may not produce tears. That is a far more specific thing. Let's take a second and break this behavior down into some separate parts here. Crying or screaming, any instance in which Justin engages in vocalizations louder than is used for communication. So now we set a note for what is louder than used for communication. How you and I would normally talk to one another or talk to other people who are near us, that is normal communication. That is for communication. When I start to get louder and now I'm screaming and crying or screaming, it's louder and louder, more than just at my regular tone and pitch. And that's happening, according to this definition, for longer than 3 seconds. Now you are being able to track that as crying or screaming. And whether or not I have tears does not seem to be the biggest indicator of crying happening because the behavior is crying/screaming. Great. So some examples, when you're doing an operational definition, examples are extremely important and helpful. Some examples of Justin's behaviors here are loud vocalizations with tears when presented with a task demand. So he's being tasked to do something. All of a sudden, we got that crying, screaming, loud vocalization because we know it happened for more than 3 seconds. And there are tears in here. Another example is loud vocalizations, not accompanied by tears when told he could not have an iPad. So this might be a little bit more like in the screaming side of things of this definition because we don't really quite see those tears, but it all fits in as this is the behavior we are tracking. You see that these are much more clear than the original definitions of crying, tantrum, flopping, right? And as helpful, I'm going to put this out there, as helpful as examples are, non-examples are just as important. They tell us what the behavior is not, and that's critical when you're deciding whether or not to track something. Non-examples help us set some very clear boundaries so observers know what doesn't count. And I will also say non-examples are exceptionally great teaching tools when you are trying to explain how to do something or anything for the first time to students, or in general, what you want and what you don't want. Very, very helpful teaching tools. So in this scenario, non-examples of crying or screaming, um, they are going to resemble the behavior, but they're actually not the behavior. So some examples are going to be laughing or giggling, because that might happen at a vocalization level that is louder than communication, but it's not quite the same as crying or screaming, clearly. Crying as a result of hurting yourself. That's a totally different reason to cry, as well as screaming for help. Very different reasons to engage in a behavior that is louder than your communication and may produce tears, because that's the context of that behavior is very different than what we are trying to track here. Or if Justin cries for the first 15 minutes after drop off, that's a whole other reason that Justin's crying. That's not to do with our specific issue that we are looking at in our classroom. Crying during drop off is a normal occurrence for many students, many young students. This new definition also includes an onset and an offset. So I'm maybe going to talk about these just because sometimes the timing of things is really important. When we use the words onset and offset, I'm not going to quiz you on vocabulary words, I promise here, but these are very like technical behavioral terms to track or that are used to describe behaviors. And you might come across them in your practice here. So the onset of a behavior is defined as 30, oh, sorry. The onset and offset guidelines tell us when to start and stop recording the behavior. The onset of the behavior is defined as 30 seconds of the occurrence. And so we begin tracking once the behavior has lasted for 30 seconds. So we have like a little timer or like 30 seconds. Now we can tally mark that behavior is happening. The offset is defined as 30 seconds of non-occurrence. And that means we stop tracking that behavior after it's been done with. You don't see it occurring anymore for at least 30 seconds. So let's say we get Justin crying and it lasts a full minute and 30 seconds have stopped, but then it starts all over again. Maybe a minute has passed and none of the behavior, the crying, screaming has happened. It's been calm, quietish for about a minute. Whatever else happens, the behavior starts again. He starts crying, screaming all over again. That's the second time you've tracked that because you had an onset and an offset to tell you how often or when to start and when to stop tracking. Now, sure, in this scenario, context is still needed, right? We're not here. We're not seeing Justin every day. We don't. We need a little bit more context. We maybe need to be familiar with the situation and the space as well. But with this level of detailed operational definition, we've also dramatically reduced the guesswork. If you were sent here as someone into this classroom as someone who needs to third party kind of observe the behavior, and this is what you were given as your parameters for whether or not a behavior occurred, and let's say you're just doing check marks, you should theoretically be able to sit there and watch whether or not Justin was crying and screaming according to this definition. Anyone tracking the behavior in this situation, you or someone else, should have a much clearer idea of exactly what to look for, which helps ensure that the data we collect is accurate and consistent. Now, in this same scenario, if Justin is told he can't have the iPad and he begins making loud vocalizations that last longer than 30 seconds, we can confidently count that as an episode of crying. As you can see, everyone here is like, that's crying. And if we're collecting data on how long the behavior occurs, you would start the timer as soon as the behavior has lasted for 30 seconds, and again, stop when the behavior is stopped for 30 seconds without any crying. And you might be wondering, why are we tracking how long the behavior is happening? Again, because longer behaviors also usually have a bigger impact on the student, the class, the instruction, the whole length of your day, right? If your student is crying, as according to our behavior, for a straight hour, that's a straight hour of them not learning, probably of your other students, probably of yourself. And now you and your peers have headaches. There's a lot happening where this behavior is having quite a significant impact, and tracking how long it happens might be very telling or very informative when you're trying to figure out what to do next. It could also be really helpful in seeing if interventions are working, tracking the time of behavior. So let's say we've been working on Justin to learn how to self-soothe or cope when he is being told he can't have an iPad, right? And although he starts to cry in this moment where he's told, sorry, you can't have that iPad, he starts to cry. But within those first 30 seconds, he uses some of his internal learned self-soothing behaviors and stops and accepts and redirects or self-corrects. And we are then able to make an observational note and say, Justin was observed using his counting strategy when he began to cry. Great. And we won't be able to count that as a time that the behavior happened, but we might be able to count that as a time we observed the intervention working. And that's telling us the intervention helped. Accurate data collection in this situation, in all situations, will lead to better outcomes for our learners specific to behavior. The operational definitions are a very critical step in making that happen. Let's pause and take a look at two examples of how we can improve behavior definitions. One from a classroom serving students with mild to moderate support needs, and one from a classroom serving students with extensive support needs. In the mild to moderate support needs example, B was the better option. So the first option saying Patty is non-compliant doesn't tell us much. What is she doing? When is it happening? How would we track it? Now we compare that to Patty refuses to begin independent work within 30 seconds of the direction being given and turns head away from assignment. This version of the definition of the behavior is clear, it's observable, and it's measurable. Exactly what we need for strong data collection and shared understanding across staff. The same idea is for the extensive support needs example. A was the correct answer. So saying Emerson is aggressive is too vague, but Emerson hits the table with a closed fist and pushes materials off the table when presented with a non-preferred activity. Now we've got something we can actually observe, we can define and support. Could these definitions here be refined even further? Yes, there's always room to get more specific depending on your setting. But the main key takeaway I want you to have here is that the more specific a definition, the better the data and the better the support. We don't have to get maybe all into the weeds for every single behavior, but knowing that for some behaviors, additional level of detail and definition really do matter in order to understand what it is we're looking at here. When we define behaviors, we are not just checking a box. We are setting ourselves and our students up for more effective interventions and real progress. Instead of the whole getting frustrated and be like, nothing I've tried is working, maybe because the thing that you've been trying is not actually directly attacking the behavior you're trying to fix. If you've been wondering, how am I supposed to observe and track behavior when I'm literally running an entire classroom? Or if you have tried in the past and we're not like immediately successful, please know that that's a common question and experience. The big secret here is that you don't and shouldn't need to track everything at the exact same time. You just need to track the thing that you're focused on in that moment. You are a human and your brain and body can only do so much at once. So don't stress yourself out and think I have 7 kids with 7 behavior issues and I have to track them all day long at the same time. You have to be strategic and have kind of systems in place to help you make those tracking moments as smoothly as possible. But in most cases, if you observed one, keep note, take a tally, do something, and move forward. Try your best to focus on one at a time and keep your system for tracking simple. This is my best advice to you. Keep your system for tracking simple. Use a sticky note, have a clipboard with tally marks, do a quick check on the whiteboard. I had a teacher who always kind of carried around like a little notebook and would just like a plus sign, a negative sign. They kind of created their own little code because they didn't want students to have to, they could maybe look at the book and say, Belkis, negative behavior 7 times. And like, now we've caused a whole other issues. But if I use it and I kind of make my own little code, maybe initials, maybe the seat number or something like that. And I'm like, plus, negative, check, check, check. I can do with that data after I'm done teaching, but in the moment, this is a quick thing I can do to track while I'm teaching. I also suggest keeping your data tracking tool, whatever it is you're using, close. Some teachers are incredibly effective managing technologies at the exact same time. And so some may have an iPad tracker, Google Sheet tracker, an Excel spreadsheet tracker, whatever it is you do, keep it close to yourself, and stick to whatever systems you are using at that time. So if you're a sticky note user or somebody who jots down on the whiteboard or pen and pad or computer person, doesn't matter. Pick your system, stick to it. That's where you take notes. It doesn't mean you can't change systems later, but in that moment, you don't want to like have a sticky note here and have something on the whiteboard over there. And remember that you wrote something down and you stuck it on your computer screen for later. One system, don't confuse yourself. One system, make it work for yourself. If you're like me, I'm somebody who's like voice to text, and I will like voice to text. I'll send myself a text message. I'm like, today during math, James was observed once getting up for materials without permission. I know we know what the behavior is being tracked. I can keep it like that, and later I can go in and add more into it. But that'll just be a quick note to myself, and I will deal with it once I have a little bit more breathing room or space. So your system, you know, it does not have to be perfect. It does not have to be formal in all situations. As long as you have that good definition and you know what you're tracking, the system that you do it with can be cleaned up a little bit after the fact, as long as you are able to track when it happens. All right. We are going to watch the first 45 seconds of this video that depicts a student, Dan, being disruptive.
All right, let's review our American history. Where did the Boston Tea Party occur? Very good, very good. Okay. Let's see. Who were the Axis powers in World War II?
The Nazis and the Italians.
No, we're not on the Axis. Hey, pay attention. Okay, this is going to be on the test. All right, very good. Who were the Allies?
England, France, America.
Okay, any more? Any more?
Pause and reflect on the Disruptive Dan video that you just saw.